what advice would you give to, say, someone who was out in the community trying to open a clinical trial? What should they be thinking about as the trial is being opened to say, I can, I think we're supposed to have microphones. Okay, they're coming. I can do this and potentially increase enrollment for all patients. Mhm.
So I think one of the first things that I would ask is, do we have the population that's going to fit that trial, right? I think that's really, really important. I will say, again, I've seen a lot of mismatch where people open up a study for stomach cancer, but they really don't have that many stomach cancer patients that are walking through the door. So that would be the first thing that I would say is, do we have the right demographics, not just in the community, but who's walking through the door of the institutions to kind of make that fit? And then I think, it's really important to think about the strategy for spreading the word about particular studies. That includes kind of having that community voice, that patient voice as part of the study team. They can really help raise awareness. That's really been helpful. And then making sure that we actually have, I would say, the focus on how do we make sure that our providers are supported in the way that they need to be so that they can accrue the greatest number of patients. Because that can be a challenge, again, depending on the size of the institution. But I've even seen large institutions where they really don't have the right infrastructure that's there. And again, this is where our sponsors can help too, asking those questions. Just ask how many providers do you have? What sort of support do you have to actually make sure the study gets accrued to?
Thank you. And yes, Matthew, Dr. Learning.
Coming back to kind of of a small part of a much larger societal problem, right? Where are we going to go as a society to bring clinical trial back to the masses so that we normalize clinical research, right? I mean, when's the last time you went to your primary care provider or your child's pediatrician, right, and you were approached about a clinical trial which is minimal risk, right, which introduces this concept into society that clinical trials can be valuable, right? So that when you do get breast cancer or you do get, diagnosed with a disorder, that hearing about clinical trials, you just don't go up, right? The fence goes up about, oh my gosh, I'm going to be that mouse, right? And the Time article in the cage, right? And everybody hears it. I don't want to be, the gerbil in the cage. How do we break down or lower the fence about that discussion and rewind getting clinical trials back where it should be starting, at least the dialogue on it, which is prevention?
Hey, that's a deep one.
So since you called me out, I will say one of the things that I've done in the past is actually go to primary care providers and done educational courses. When I was associate director of the Cancer Center at Wake Forest, we spent a lot of time with our primary care providers just for that reason, right? I did something similar when I was in Boston, but not at the same scale. And so we actually did talk about the importance of clinical research. And I'm going to use the term clinical research, okay? Because that's exactly what that is. If it's not interventional, sometimes using the term trial can be off-putting to folks. So clinical research. And you're absolutely right. Part of what we need to do is get people involved in those non-interventional trials, so that they can actually start to say, oh, okay, this wasn't so bad, right? And I think that's one thing that can certainly be done. I will say that the NCORE research base, particularly at Wake Forest, does a lot on symptom management. That's all it does, right? It focuses on symptom management. It's a great way to introduce clinical research to individuals who may not otherwise kind of be thoughtful of it. But I will say, finally, that's the job of our NCI-designated comprehensive cancer centers, right?
Yeah.
Is the community outreach and engagement.
And I want to kind of hit on something that you did. I mean, I think it's also not only the patients, it's also obviously the providers. And I do agree, you'd mentioned that we're kind of broken, and I agree with that. I think it's a lot, to open a clinical trial. And I love research, it's all I do. And there's even days where maybe it's easier on a given patient to just say our standard of care is going to be this, let's go to the next patient. So I think we really do need to be creative about how we restructure research so it's not such a burden, so there's real motivation for investigators to be excited about getting patients on trials, and then to your point, really thinking about then making it something a patient's excited to be part of. But I think that's going to require a lot of complicated adjustments in the way we're built right now.
And anyone here is welcome to come ask questions, please. So let's make this
Also have
conversation.
something to say. I don't know if this.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Something that I recommend to everyone, whether your industry, a provider, a researcher, anything, is there's an organization out there called CISCRP. We've done a little bit of collaboration with them in the past. IHE has, and they're all about clinical research education for the general public. I've served on quite a few of their boards evaluating trial language. And they ask for, lay people, they ask for providers, they ask for everyone. They have all kinds of educational materials out there that providers can order for their clinics that are in different languages, that speak to different race and, ethnic groups. So there are organizations that are out there that are doing the work, and they're looking to collaborate with every, different factor of our society. And so I found that the resources that they have, they've been making a lot of progress. They go to health fairs, they're just, doing regular, blood pressure, like testing, all that kind of thing, just to get into the community and have those conversations about this is what research really is and what it could look like. And I found that their resources are amazing.
I was, speaking, coming back to normalization of the conversation or the discussion about clinical trials, I was having a discussion with my 17-year-old who's preparing for his ACT, right? So he's taking numerous practice exams, right? And I asked him, just out of a sense of curiosity, how many of the foils or the questions, right, started off with, a person is in a clinical trial, or a person is being studied, or a group of people are being studied, right? You get the discussions about the trains going to the left and the trains going to the right, but and then trying to figure out the answer from a physics or a math. But we haven't actually normalized the discussion about participating in research into society. And sometimes the only way to do that is to start the questions, right? I remember back in elementary school where we had to actually do a thought experiment of designing a trial, right, of red versus blue dyes, or number of drops, and asking the questions of curiosity, that actually normalizes this discussion rather than penalizes the discussion.
Well, I will say the pandemic has taken its toll on science, period. So we're in a very different era right now. And I think there needs to be a return back to what is true. And we actually need to start building back the faith in the science apparatus in general. So I like your idea of thinking about non-interventional trials as a way to kind of include more people. But again, I will say the faith in science is shot because of a lot of the rhetoric from back there, and it's back in the current administration. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around that, I will say.
So Dr. Hantel, I'm going to sort of move the conversation because this really involves you in a way, right? You talked about the Dophinol, which seems to be such a simple concept, and you talked about the percentage of people who are not able to enroll in a clinical trial. And this whole Dophinol thing, everyone's known about it for years, and we keep talking about it. And, as Dr. Snyder was showing his slide about, in the NCCN guidelines, that could be something the NCCN guidelines could actually immediately adopt. So,
yeah, I think I'm
what say you?
5 to 10 years behind you in terms of the work on this. So hopefully, our trial that is just going to be starting soon on Dophinol will maybe lead to some of those similar recommendations. But I think in general, it's kind of paradigmatic for something that we've known about for a while, and yet there's so many barriers to implementation from the side of bureaucracy and the regulatory sense, from the side of even just like people who know what benign ethnic neutropenia was who don't even know that Duffy null exists, and that it's been kind of the standard now for 10 plus years to talk about it in that way. And we don't even have testing at the majority of the hospitals across the US for clinicians to be able to even order it. And so most people don't even know it exists. Most people don't have the ability to order it despite it being widely available, super cheap, all of these things. And this is like a simple, very biological driven thing, and we can't even do that. So how are we expected to do trial navigation, all these huge things that take a lot more manpower and everything else? And I think it's somewhat, cynically kind of disappointing that we have this like super low-hanging fruit that we can't even reach. But I think at the same time, it's like, okay, if we start chipping at it, not one by one, but kind of at all these things a little bit at the same time, that's kind of how we move this forward.
But I'm going to push you a little bit further, right? Because you work in an institution where the PUBAs are there,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So you can gather some of these PUBAs together, and an editorial could be written, and the editorial could say, at least practically speaking, this is what you should do today before we get the data, because we don't always have to have clinical phase 3 randomized data to
So
answer
the
every
New England
question.
Journal article, we wrote that and it came out
Yes.
a couple months ago.
Yes.
So it does kind of say what we should be doing
Yes.
and how we should be doing it.
But now you gotta take
I
it
was
one
the
more
only
step, though.
small pooba in that article. But
No, you were a big
but,
PUBA.
But I agree. I think and I agree. I mean, what we're doing essentially at Dana-Farber is trying to implement that along with a lot of the other things that Karen spoke to very eloquently and that others have been doing too. And I think it's that, we need to attack it from the regulatory, the infrastructure, the contracting and budgeting for trials, the navigation, how Dana-Farber is interacting with its referring sites, how it's decentralizing, how we are working as investigators with trial sponsors to make sure that the trials aren't always just opening up at Dana-Farber and they're opening up at other places across the country. So I think it's just one of a myriad of things.
Yeah, I want to agree very much. You are not 5 or 10 years behind. The data are compelling, in my opinion. And I literally, when you were speaking, just emailed our group with your publication because we have opened a trial specifically to look at the impact of race on an immune-based therapy. And my first patient was a medical professional who's Black, suffering from neutropenia, where we dose held. And we had this same discussion over and over. And so I just emailed our group. I'm like, this was built by us, and we think about this, and we did not modify the criteria. This is an education piece, and I think, to your point, a regulatory piece. I think it is ready, at least for consideration of
No,
prime
so
time.
the way
we
you do
have-
this
we-
PUBA
yeah,
business
yeah,
is that,
yeah.
so you take it, you take it from a Dana-Farber PUBA to ASCO, Dr. Guerra will be talking about that. You bring ASCO in, you bring ASH in, and now it's not just those, crazy people from the East Coast.
So to ASH's credit, they have a very large initiative about Duffy and reference ranges that they're in the midst of right now that Lauren, the mentee I spoke about, is actually helping run. And so we are working with them and hopefully going to be starting to work with ASCO and others on this. So I think there's probably even more things that I'm just forgetting to say.
But where's the agency on this, right? I mean, they forced the hand of Project Optimus, right?
Yeah,
Everything I
yeah.
think of Optimus, I think of Transformers. So I'm like, where's Bumblebee, in this discussion? Why can't there be a sub-arm, right, of patients that that we can then, discreetly study? And, they're forcing the hand of finding the right dose, the right schedule, making phase 1 trials much more complex, right? And actually slowing, in some ways, clinical research forward, right, into the classical paradigm of clinical research. But if we're going to slow the machine down to figure the right dose and the right schedule, we should be able to focus on the right populations then, too, in some of these subarms. And I think that's the FDA has to be a hand-in-hand partner even beyond ASH and ASCO. I mean, they can force, but if the regulators are the people who, and I think Chris is going to talk about this, boilerplating eligibility, we need to be forcing, the hand of the FDA in a respectful and safe manner.
Yeah, so 2 points to that. One is that we have been trying to, I think, somewhat through the through the cooperative groups, we have been starting to make headway directly going to the FDA and to NCI in terms of CTCAE has been met essentially just with silence over the past several months. So that's just been there's been no conversation, which has been difficult despite people much higher up the totem pole than me kind of trying to initiate that conversation. Welcome anybody to join me in that. But the other thing is that there are trials that the FDA is now I would say, agreeing with in terms of having Duffy-specific populations and testing and everything else. So there's a SWOG trial, Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, basically all of their platform studies are now including that, so there is definite headway being made. I think it is just, at the moment, kind of trying to recognize that if the top-down approach is not going to work, we need to continue to force the bottom-up approach until we can get that.
So Sam, as we finish, I just want you to talk about your calculator and say, okay, based on everything we've heard, you know, you talked about the calculator becoming more frontal. I mean, what else do you want to say to everyone here about why this calculator potentially could be a tool that could continue to force people to report data in a way it should be reported?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I applaud the Beer Hoorays for working on is on the calculator, it's a 0 to 5. Like, it's such a simple score that once you know the ranking system, you can just say, hey, I got a score of 3, and everybody's like, 3, that's clinical trial excellence. And it's just very easy to understand. And so if we have the calculator being widespread and widely used, then it creates a platform for us to talk about it in a way that everyone can easily understand, whether that be patients, the general population, clinicians, physicians, whatever it is. We can just talk about it super easily and openly without having to go in and be like, well, for my area, that doesn't really apply, which is why I think the surveys are super helpful, because you guys are the ones that are in it. You're treating the patients, you're working with patients, your industry. You know what's going on more than my or I do necessarily. And so trying to incorporate all of those things to make those conversations as easy as possible, I think that's the most important.
I'm sensing we're getting near a break, so I'll be brief. Regarding the calculator, how are your IRBs using information like that? Why are they even opening trials that aren't 3 or above it within the scores, or are they looking at other predictors of diversification for their, I mean, I work for Beijing, Paul Ward, head of medical affairs. We're doing our part to write better trials. We'll write even better trials if IRBs demand that these be done, and it'll be more universal, just to Dr. Beeray's question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We're trying to work with ASH, with ASCO, with Blood, because a big issue with it is the conversations just haven't been there, period. I think 2020 was a big year for starting those conversations. But a lot of people just don't realize that this is an issue. This is something that directly affects patients, especially minority of patients. We don't truly know the efficacy of a drug. We don't truly know the outcomes, the side effects of a drug if we aren't testing. And so I think that's the great question. Why aren't companies doing this more? And I think we're going to hear a little bit about more about that today.
Yeah, I would say one of the main things, to Sam's point, is that a lot of these companies, they don't know. They have a conversation, and that is one of the big things, but behind the calculator, why it's publicly available, is that you might think that you're doing well when you're enrolling, 10, 20, 30, African-American patients. But that's not reflective of the disease state. That's not reflective of the area that you're in. And, relative to all the other, groups that you're enrolling, it might not be enough. And I think that having a number that correlates to, okay, I know, like Sam said, a 3 is at that excellent point. You kind of start to get an idea of what those proportions and things kind of look like. And one of the big things with the calculator is it's not intended to, quote unquote, punish you. There's not this idea of, if I'm never going to get to that 5. It's, generally speaking, fairly easy to get to a 5. We did that on purpose because the idea is that we want to live in a world where every single trial is a 5. It reflects what our, nation, what the world already looks like. So you should be able to get to a 5, fairly easily. So I think the big thing is that lack of knowledge.
So Brian, when you present trials to your IRB, are you asked questions about these types of topics? Do you have to show scores? Do you have to show diversification efforts? How's that working here in Indiana?
Yeah, I think it's a dynamic situation. Diversity is always asked for, both in terms of race and ethnicity.
That's a bad word, Brian.
What's
You can't use diversity. You got to think of a different word.
Oh, I'm just going to say what I wanted. That's okay. So they do ask for that, but how much attention if you don't meet those criteria, does it shut you down? The answer is no. It's something that's requested for. And to your point, the Drive score or the Drive calculator, I think, does a much better job of looking at this holistically. And as you guys were talking today, was thinking about talking to whether it be our IRB or our SRC, where a lot of the scientific decisions are made. I think it is something that should be kind of blended in.
All right, thank you so much. We're behind, but great conversation.
Good job, guys.